Okay. So thank you everyone who decided to come today. So this is going to be our interview review just before our showcase. So obviously this is the sign-in link. I now have the sign-in link over my shoulder, so in case if anybody joins during the course of it, they can also sign in. So we can just get started. Here's all the QR codes to join our Facebook and our GroupMe, in case if you are interested. Um, but then this is going to be our final update because tomorrow is our scroll case. It starts at 5, so be sure you are there on time. If you RSVP'd, today is the last day to RSVP, and if you've RSVP'd already, or if you RSVP'd before, I think, Saturday, you probably got an email over the weekend, essentially giving some more details about the event. So be sure that you read that if you did receive that email, because that will just give you more details as to how the event will be planned, how it will play out essentially. And then also, in case if you weren't here or didn't hear, sadly, L3 Harris and Intel dropped out. So if you want to talk to L3 Harris, they will be at the normal career showcase on I think the 21st to the 24th. I think they'll be there all 4 days according to their email that they sent me. Intel I don't think is going to be there, so you will just have, if you're interested in talking to Intel, we may potentially express interest in possibly doing a talk at some point later in the semester, but there will be no recruiting at UF from Intel either now or at the showcase. Moving on, we're going to start with elevator pitches just because this is something that's going to be pertinent tomorrow. Your elevator pitch is just a quick verbal overview of your experience, and what you're looking for from the recruiters. So this is your point to talk about your major, any internships that you've had, any projects you worked on. This is your opportunity to let them know who you are and why you're there and what you want out of talking to them. So just a general format. This is going to be a deep cut that was literally made before any of us were born, but The Princess Bride, Ignio Montoya. So hello, my name is Ignio Montoya. You killed my father, prepare to die. Obviously, that's not necessarily the exact format you want to say to a recruiter when you're at a career fair, but the general format is the same. You want a polite greeting, you want your name, you want to express why you're there and why you're talking to that person, and then you want to manage expectations. You want to tell them what you want out of it. So obviously your elevator pitch is mainly just meant to cover what's on your resume and is meant to basically give them a brief overview of what's on your resume, what is important about you that you think would be appealing to them, and then what you want out of talking to them. So now we might break up into breakout rooms, and you guys can have an opportunity to go over your elevator pitches. I'll probably just set a timer for a few minutes, and you guys can take turns each doing one. And then you guys can take turns each giving your elevator pitch, and then you can have a minute to talk about it and give feedback. So I'll probably give you guys 3 minutes or so. So I am going to assign breakout rooms, and I'm just going to randomly assign you. So I'm going to open the rooms now. You can scan it, but otherwise we're going to move on. And now we're going to actually start talking about interviews. So your interview is your opportunity to show the recruiter that you're more than just what you put on your resume. It's your opportunity to be more personable, be charming, be professional. And you just need to keep in mind that whenever you're in these interviews, to be as respectful as possible, because you're not only representing yourself, but also UF, the engineering department, and then SCRO. But when you're in these interviews, you're most likely you're gonna have 2 main types of questions, which are behavioral and technical, and I'll get into that. So behavioral is your non-technical questions. They usually focus on things like teamwork, time management, interpersonal relations, or problem solving. They require you to recall projects you've worked on. It's more qualitative than quantitative. You usually don't want to bring up any sort of data that you have unless if it's really an effect of what you're talking about. Like if like you could be talking about like a time where you had to work with a team member who wasn't as productive as you thought they were going to be, and basically how you dealt with them. And then like you might need to talk about like your grades or something like that when it comes to it. Like a lot of the time whenever they ask a team related question, they'll usually want to know like what sort of grade did you get on it. Was it like an A, B, if you remember the percentage grade. But other than that, you don't really need anything qualitative or quantitative. It primarily is qualitative. I keep getting them mixed up. The other questions that you're going to get are technical. These could be about your projects that you've worked on or about prerequisite knowledge for the position. They may also be about skills you've acquired that are of interest to the company. This is where you're going to be focused more on the quantitative side of things, and that's when the recruiter is most likely going to be asking about like your processes as to how you worked on the engineering side of things rather than the teamwork side of things. So let's talk more about behavioral questions. So they usually address things like teamwork, client-facing skills, the ability to adapt, time management skills, communication skills, motivation, and values. So the main advice when responding to behavioral questions is using what's called the STAR technique. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, and results. Situation is basically the general story, like what project was it for, when was this, who were you working with. The task is essentially describing the challenge and the expectations. So basically this will most likely be the focus of what the question is asking about. Like if it's asking about a time you had to deal with someone you didn't trust or anything like that, this is where you would talk about that. Action is where you talk about your plan, where you talk about basically how you dealt with the challenge. Um, like let's say you were dealing with someone who didn't want to do their work, and essentially you had to uh, I don't know, like make Gantt charts and basically create a schedule to make sure everyone was getting their work done. Action is where you would talk about that. Then results, this is where you would add in any quantitative data. It would basically you would tell the interviewer basically about how you did on this project, any sort of recognition or anything that you got on it. And so the types of questions that you would usually see are these sorts of questions, like give an example of a time you faced a conflict while working on a team. How did you handle that? Describe a time where you had to interact with a difficult client. What was the situation? How do you handle it? Tell me about a time you failed. How did you deal with the situation? Tell me about a time you were under a lot of pressure. What was going on? How do you get through it? Time management skills. Describe a long-term project that you managed. How did you keep everything moving along in a timely manner? Tell me about a successful presentation you gave and why you think it was a hit. Tell me about your proudest professional accomplishment. Tell me about a time where you were dissatisfied in your work. What could have been done to make it better? While I suggest looking over these questions would be like a great way to start if you are preparing for an interview, I wouldn't rely too much on these particular questions because not every recruiter is going to be asking you the same behavioral questions. I would just use these as a guideline to think of stories and think of projects that you've worked on, and basically think about how aspects of those projects fit into the star format, because you have to be versatile and you can't necessarily just focus on one question, because in the middle of an interview, if they ask you a question they weren't expecting, you're going to get thrown off by it. And so it's just better to think of general stories in your head rather than having prepared answers, um, just so that you can be versatile in case if they ask you a different type of question than you were expecting. Moving on to the technical side of things, we are a semiconductor club, so our focus is mainly on the semiconductor industry. So it'll focus on things like device processing, device components, device physics, performance, voltage, current leakage. We have some example questions on the right. But the thing about this is that about just technical questions in general is that it's okay if you don't know how to answer the questions on the previous slide. That's what Scro is for. That's what our lecture series is for. We are going to eventually get to those topics. And also, recruiters don't expect you to come into the interview with a knowledge of literally everything. That's why they train you, especially if you're an undergraduate or an underclassman, or you've never had an internship before. They don't expect you to come in and know how to do your job in full. That's why they want to give people internships, is so that they can basically groom you to hire you out of college. And also, if they anticipate that you're not going to have a full knowledge of what the actual position is for, they'll most likely ask you more technical questions about your personal experience rather than technical questions that would be geared towards the position itself. And so now that we're done with this, we are going to go over some personal anecdotes about some interviews that Colin and I have had recently over the past couple of weeks. So I'm going to let Colin start first.
Hey everyone. I kind of had a unique experience. I applied for a company that manufactures medical wire, and I applied for them on Monday last week. So I pretty much instantly heard back from one of their hiring managers, and we scheduled a phone interview for Tuesday at 6:30. But what happened was it's Tuesday 6:30. I did get a phone call. Um, so I waited 15 minutes and called the interviewer, and she actually, because she responded so fast, or this is how she explains it to me, she forgot that she scheduled an interview, so I had to reschedule it for Wednesday. So it's kind of like, you know, am I going to be a valued employee or whatever? Is kind of ridiculous. Um, but if you ever get in that situation, don't be afraid to call your interviewer, especially if they don't call you within like the 15-minute time mark from your interview. But so we rescheduled it for Wednesday, and she called me. It's a pretty basic preliminary phone interview. It's just um, kind of like a interview just to get to know me. So the interviewer spent about 5 minutes talking about the company and more specifically like the location and what they do. Um, kind of about a little bit about the process. She didn't have like any sort of like technical degree. She majored in, I can't necessarily the name, but she was an HR with no technical background. So um, as you can see on the slides, most of my questions were like, okay, tell me about yourself. Why do you want to work for this company and specifically like this location? And why do you think we should hire you for this position? Um, I spent about maybe 15, 20 minutes answering that. And then we got around to like the very limited technical questions that she could ask me. This one I was actually very confused on. How well do you work with electronics? I truly didn't know what she meant by that. So I just asked her to elaborate a little bit more. And she was really meaning like, she told me, like, okay, so I have this engineer. When something breaks down, we had a panel that broke down the other day, and he worked on the circuitry and on the coding. So that's what she meant by that question. Um, and then the other technical question was, if equipment were to fail, how would you go about fixing it? So it was like pretty basic questions. It was just a preliminary phone interview kind of thing. Um, can you go to the next slide, Hunter? So these are the main takeaways from that experience. I just don't be afraid to call the interview, or if the interview doesn't happen at the specific time. So I waited 15 minutes. I feel like that was a good time to wait, but maybe you could do shorter. Maybe you could do like 10 minutes. So when we did reschedule, I sent follow-up emails just to make sure to remind her and to also remind myself. And it kind of like shows like, hey, uh, this is important to me, and kind of shows like you're a little bit more adamant about the position. Um, if an interview asks you a question that you don't understand, like you can talk to them and say like, "Hey, I don't really understand this question. Can you uh, ask it in a different way?" Or even if you don't know the answer to the question, you can say, "Well, I'm not really sure what the answer is, but this is how I would go about doing this," or something like that. I also heavily recommend to like research the company, the interviewer, and the location you're applying to. I know those are pretty basic things, but when it comes to your interview, it'll show that you have knowledge of the role that you'll be filling, and you'll understand a little bit more about the perspective of the interviewer and what kind of questions they might ask. So, for instance, the person that was interviewing me was just in an HR position, so she wouldn't really ask a whole lot of technical questions, allowing me to prepare a little bit more for like the behavioral stuff. Um, my last recommendation is to try to make conversation when possible. Allows the interviewer to get you to know you a little bit better, a little bit on a more personal level, and depending on the position, you might be working with this person for you know 40 hours a week. So it's not only like in the best interest of the interviewer to find somebody that can do the job, but someone that they could talk to and not uh, like hate pretty much when you're working with them. So that's pretty much just my experiences from last week.
Hey, thanks, Colin. So I actually had two interviews. They were both with the same company for the same position. The first one was a couple weeks ago, and then the next one was a follow-up interview I had this past week. So the first interview was one interviewer on a video call that lasted about 30 minutes. When I was supposed to join 10 minutes before my interview time just to get set up, and then when the time that my interview was supposed to be came around, I joined and the interviewer couldn't see me, but I could see and hear him. Um, or he couldn't see or hear me, but I could see and hear him. So we ended up moving to a phone call. The interview, other than that, went pretty smoothly. It was mostly behavioral questions. So he asked me about a time where I needed to change my workflow to accommodate somebody else, and then I needed to talk about a time where I needed to work with someone I didn't trust. Um, and so I answered those with two different projects from school, from two different classes. Um, then the technical questions, neither of them focused on um, neither of them focused on the position itself. They asked me what in my coursework or internships prepared me to work in the semiconductor industry, and then they asked me like what I knew about the company. Um, they asked me what I knew about the company, about what they did, and so I told them everything that I knew about them because, like Colin said, you probably should do research about the company that you're working for. Um, they asked me to elaborate on my projects. The main one that they wanted me to elaborate on was this one that I have a snippet from my resume on. It was called Peak 3D Printing, where it was essentially a design project where we had to redesign hardware for an FDM 3D printer. And so they wanted me to basically explain my process on that and explain like whether or not I worked in a group, like what my role was in the group, and then basically the outcome as to like whether it was well received from our professor or not. And then the second interview didn't go as smoothly, to be completely honest. I had two interviewers on a conference call. It lasted about 45 minutes, but when I called them, I didn't get my recruiters. I got it was a line for the company, but it was basic. But when I called, it basically gave me a message saying that phone line had been deactivated, and so I immediately started to panic, and so I started spamming the person who helped like who like set up my interview with phone calls until they eventually picked up after roughly 6 times. And then they finally picked up. They asked me what phone number I had. I told them the one that was sent to me in the email, and they were just like, "That's not this year's phone number. That's last year's phone number." And it was a 4 number difference. someone didn't send me the right phone number. But when I eventually got in, I was like very panicked. I apologized a lot to my interviewers. They didn't seem to think it was as big of a deal as I did, but I was very stressed nonetheless. And also this interview was a lot more chaotic to say the least. They went all over the place. They asked me about my technical skills, how I developed them. They asked me what technical skills I had that I think would be helpful in this role. Um, they asked about some of my projects in particular. They asked about Peak, the one that I mentioned last time. I mentioned that I was responsible for material selection. So they basically asked me, what my process was, what database I used, uh, basically what properties I filtered by to end up getting my final material, and what was beneficial about my final material, what were any drawbacks about it. They also asked me about Scro. They asked me about being the president of it and trying to basically how I kept it general enough to not alienate any majors or any experience level. And then they ended up turning it around and they made it more personal. They asked me what type of person I was outside of school. They wanted me to talk about my personal life, my hobbies, my sports. They asked me about my family, siblings. Uh, I talked to them about like my relationship with my friends, what I do outside of school. Um, they asked me if I was considering grad school. Then they asked me like what my dream school would be if like money wasn't an object. And then the question that really threw me off was they turned around and they asked me a hypothetical situation where they asked me what would I do if my lifelong best friend stole the answers to our final exam worth 70% of our grade. um, and they basically wanted me to like work out loud what I was thinking and like what I would do in that scenario. And then their final question was how did I prepare for the interview, which um, was mainly just looking at behavioral questions, doing research on the company and like it was a packaging internship, which is like a back end process in semiconductor manufacturing. Um, it was a packaging internship, and they basically asked like what I like looked up and what I was like researching. So I told them that sort of stuff. And so the takeaways from it is the first 2 points kind of go together. It's try not to let things get to your head, and it's okay for things to go wrong. Definitely when I got into that second interview after panicking, after essentially having a mini panic attack within 5 minutes. Um, uh, I was, to say the least, I was very distracted when I started my interview, and I feel like it impeded my performance a little bit. So it's important to not let those sorts of things get to your head, even though that it can be hard in the moment. Like the recruiters were very understanding, but I still let it get to me. And speaking of the recruiters are human and they want to like you. Your interviewer, usually doesn't want to hate you. The reason why they're interviewing you to begin with is because they think that you can be a fit on at their company. The reason that um, the reason that they don't just hire you off of a resume is because they want to make sure that you are a good person, if you are a charismatic, likable person, that you aren't just an awful human being. um they also want to make sure that like you can speak about the stuff that you've worked on with some sort of eloquence, that you can explain yourself and explain your process. um you can also be funny if you have the chance. Obviously don't go out of your way to make jokes, but if it's part of your normal personality and you can make little jokes as you go along, the recruiters will like that. Um, if you don't need to fill the air every moment of the interview. If you need it, you can take a moment to pause and collect your thoughts. Basically, every single answer that you give to a recruiter as part of an interview is essentially an assertion. It's an assertion as to why you should be hired. Um, and basically like any essay where you've ever had to just write for a word count, if you're writing for just to talk or just to get to a word count, you'll always lose focus on what your argument actually is, and you'll end up rambling onto something else. So if you feel like you're just talking to talk, then try to find a stopping point and try to move on to the next question. Or if they ask a follow up question, then answer their follow up question. But try to not to ramble if you don't need to. Um, like I said earlier, you want to be versatile. You don't want to just have things memorized. Be prepared to talk about things that aren't on your resume and that you weren't prepared to talk about. So don't just memorize the answer to behavioral questions that you looked up on the internet. Be sure that you just have those general stories prepared, just so that you can draw from them in case if you have a behavioral question that's applicable. And also, don't be scared to admit that you're wrong or that you don't know the answer to a question. They want you to understand, or they want to understand your thought process on a problem, and they want to know how you think through problems, and they especially like hearing you think out loud during an interview, because thinking out loud essentially gives them insight into what your process is and what your problem-solving process is, which is half the reason they want to interview you, is just to figure out your problem-solving process. So whether it be a situation like I was put in where I was given a hypothetical situation that I had to explain my logic in, or if you have a technical question that you're not 100% sure on how to go about it, if you talk your if you talk your way through it, they'll enjoy hearing your thought process. And even if you don't know the answer to your question, if you admit that if you admit that to them, they'll most likely explain the answer to you. And if you're engaged with their answer or with their explanation, then they'll most likely be more receptive to that. Rather, if you're just listening and don't seem to be interested in what they're saying. And so that concludes our interview review. So as I've said before multiple times, this is the sign-in code. Please be sure that if you haven't already, please be sure to fill out your RSVP for Scrowcase. Um, that does end tonight, and the event is tomorrow at 5. I'll probably send out another email tomorrow. If you haven't gotten one already, I'll be sure to send out an email to you guys. Um, Other than that, we are good here. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to stay behind and ask. But other than that, you are good to leave.